President Trump says he is prepared to travel to Turkey at short notice tomorrow for talks on ending the war in Ukraine, but he will only go if his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, shows up. President Zelenskyy has challenged Putin to meet him face-to-face in Istanbul on Thursday. In the last hour, he said he's waiting to see who will represent Russia at the proposed talks before determining Ukraine's next steps. But asked earlier who will travel from Moscow, the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov refused to answer. The Russian delegation will be waiting for the Ukrainians, he said, in Istanbul on May the 15th. President Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff says it's unclear if President Putin will attend. Witkoff and the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio will be there. Let's speak to Sam Greene, who is Professor of Russian Politics at King's College London. Very nice to see you. Over the weekend, President Putin calls a press conference at 2 a.m. in the morning in which he calls for direct talks with President Zelenskyy. But on the eve of those talks, there's no sign of him coming. Why would he suggest the talks and then not turn up?
Well, he didn't say that it would be direct talks between him and Zelenskyy. He said it would be direct talks between Russia and Ukraine. In other words, not mediated in the ways that some of the earlier talks have been. It was taken as a signal that he was, I think, jarred a little bit by some of the pressure that was coming from the White House. The White House had complained about Russian foot dragging and that it might be ready to walk away from this process, as well as, from some of the signals that the Europeans had been sending after the visit by Keir Starmer and others to Kiev a day earlier, in which they had threatened increased sanctions and increased military support for the Ukrainians if Russia didn't agree to a ceasefire. Russia doesn't want to agree to that ceasefire. And so it was an attempt at one-upmanship and trying to shift the game a little bit. I don't think that Putin necessarily calculated that Zelenskyy would call this bluff.
Yeah, well, he's been very clever, President Zelenskyy, at calling the Russians bluff. And I think it was perceived, unless I'm misreading the situation, it was perceived that he would probably come. In fact, Lula da Silva, the Brazilian, has been in Moscow today and urged him to go. President Trump is clearly urging him to go. So there is an expectation that he will turn up. What do you think the implications are if he doesn't?
Well, it will depend on who does go, right? I think it will be very difficult for Putin to see his way through to not sending anybody at all, right? Now, if somebody does go, it's likely that, whether it's before the foreign minister will not go, but somebody maybe lower down, maybe his national security advisor, his foreign policy advisor would go, certainly capable of engaging in negotiations with his Ukrainian and American counterparts if they so choose. I think the reality is that Putin's caught in a little bit of a bind. On the one hand, he does not want to get into a process that he doesn't control, and with a lot of pressure coming on from the Trump administration to move at a pace that I think Moscow finds a little uncomfortable, he may want things to slow down. On the other hand, what he's really worried about is the Europeans, particularly getting involved in Ukraine with some kind of a reinsurance force that would make it difficult for Russia to violate any potential ceasefire. And so I think he's trying to figure out what's the right pace for him to take. Does he slow things down and risk letting the Europeans find their way into this process? Or does he move at the Trump administration's pace in order to outpace the Europeans?
Professor Sam Greene, thank you very much for that. Really interesting. We'll keep an eye on any announcements tonight from the Kremlin.